And at this time, I would like to invite Will Kunder to offer a theological reflection.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, planning team, for the invitation to think about where I've seen God in our time together. That was a gutsy thing to do with a staff person who might not get another platform as good as this one. And I should probably preface anything I might offer this afternoon by acknowledging that it can't help but come through the lens of the ministry that I've enjoyed with many of you. We are not alone. We live in God's world. We believe in God who has created and is creating. We trust in God. We've been spending a little time in each other's company with the focus on growing the connections, or what for me has felt like growing our connections. We are not alone. We live in God's world. Those opening words to our creed capture for many of us just who we yearn to be as the United Church of Canada. When folks ask, does the United Church believe anything? We might answer, do you not know our creed? I was blessed to have traveled a lot within the bounds of our regional council. I have worshiped in many of your communities of faith, and as I think back on that, one of the great joys for me has been to stand with congregations as they recite a new creed. Not so new, right? It's, after all, I think 52 years old. Most of you don't need to turn to page 918 in Voices United, because the words are firmly imprinted in your minds and on your hearts. 25 years ago, that beloved statement of faith was strengthened with the addition of a commitment to live with respect in creation. Many of you know that my ministry is split now between being a half-time member of the staff team that tries to be a support to communities of faith here in our regional council, and then the other half of my life is as an Office of Vocation Minister within the Indigenous Ministries and Justice Unit of the General Council Office. IMJ has been very mindful that it's been 25 years since moderator Stan McKay's significant contribution to the Creed. I was an ordinand in 1995 and serving at the Chapel of the Delaware at Six Nations and at New Credit Church on the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I remember us hosting a couple of gatherings with Stan where he began teaching that in the church we are all treaty people. And he talked a lot about why it was essential for the concept of living with respect in creation to be added to the Creed. The Indigenous Ministries of Justice unit had great plans to encourage the church this year to think about how we might recommit ourselves denominationally to that central tenet of Indigenous spirituality. And then, of course, coronavirus arrived, and like many things, that project didn't get off the ground. But, you know, I thought that as we opened the meeting yesterday and as we began today's session, I couldn't help but think that maybe that project isn't necessary. For many, it's already pretty well embedded in our DNA. Bill Stedman's theme hymn fleshes out for me what it means for us to lift an intention to live with respect in creation. And I haven't asked your permission, Bill, but I need to confess that I forwarded the hymn to my colleagues in IMJ as a possible anthem if our project ever gets resurrected. And I want to say thanks to Lisa Blay, the chairperson of our Right Relations resource team, for starting our day in such a good way with the Thanksgiving address of the Haudenosaunee people. It's often referred to as the words before all else. And maybe some of you will know that we got a bit of a short form version of the address. Lisa, I know, knows that it can often be a half an hour or more. And as it was noted in the video this morning, it's often recited at the end of the day as well as at the beginning. it always ends with a phrase like, "We have now arrived at the place where we end our words." Of all the things we've named, it wasn't our intention to leave anything out. If something was forgotten, we leave it to each individual to send such greetings and thanks in their own way. And now our minds are one. It's a perfect, it seems to me, example of growing a connection. Through the course of the day, I'm remembering fondly how over the years we've appreciated the presence of General Council staff, including past General Secretary Nora and our new General Secretary Michael Blair. Sometimes we've even had the moderator. And I just want to say to my friend John Young, it's been good to have your presence with us, and I just selfishly hope you'll come back when we're doing so in person. One of the things that I've valued over the years is that so often General Council staff come to a gathering in one part of the church, and they then they kind of transplant ideas in other areas of the church. So we had things often that were happening here in northeastern Ontario or in northern Quebec that would suddenly show up in a conversation coming from British Columbia or one of the maritime regions. So I think about the morning, I found myself just, and saddened's not the right word, but I don't know what else to call it, but I'm thinking about the fact that the report packet was dealt with in a consent agenda. And I know that that's how it's always been. But the lament for me is that the report packet is filled with wonderful illustrations of spirit-led work right across our regional council. Work that has taken place since we gathered last time in Sault Ste. Marie. And I'm thankful that some of the breakout times have given us a chance to delve a little more deeply into the places where the Creator has been calling for our participation. The new affirming statement that we've approved today includes the words, "God's love is wider and more inclusive than we can imagine." And while that's always been our truth, I couldn't help but think as we were having our conversations about that wide and inclusive love has not always been mirrored in the living of our lives. As a person of faith, I live with the undeniable truth that my ancestors did not tend to the sort of connections that we've been focusing on together. My ancestors, I'm not sure that they were even mindful of who their neighbors were. And we see that evidenced by their attempt to destroy Indigenous culture and language, not only in this part of the world, but all across the country and in other places. We know that our church ran 13 Indian residential schools, schools that were dedicated to churning out, in the words of Mary Lavel, who was, I believe, the first president of the Women's Missionary Society. She said, "Not a reformed Indian of the past, but an entirely new product, qualified for the duties and rights of Canadian citizenship." And so we know our story. We know that to that end, kids were removed from their homes. They were placed in distant boarding schools. They were forbidden to speak their language. At their best, the people who taught them were kind. At their worst, the schools fed them badly and allowed tuberculosis and pneumonia to run rampant and turned a blind eye to sexual predators. We live at a time in our life as church and as a country where it's really important for us to not assume that that horrific history is over. In parts of our regional council, I am mindful of good work that's been going on this year. Good work that that is needed, because while both church and government have acknowledged the residential schools and are in the process of acknowledging now the 60s scoop, which again removed children from their families and placed them with non-Indigenous homes. Once we understand what's happened, the stolen land and children and the attacks on stories and songs and dances, it's clear that we have not incarnated that sort of wide and inclusive love that's now at the heart of our affirming statement. And so I find myself thinking about, in light of that, what are we to do about that as people of faith? You know, we've got some acknowledging to do, because that history sits like a ghost every time we gather as a church. We've got a history. We know we do. We need to grieve and to do so deeply, because these are matters for sorrow. We need with all of our hearts to seek reconciliation and an end to these ongoing injustices. And I'm thinking about that this weekend, because I am mindful that in the very center of our regional council, on the campus of Laurentian University, is the Apology Cairn. That spot that marks the place where the church offered its first apology. And it makes me smile to have our new OV minister, Kelly, with us, because I know that Kelly was present as a kid in that youth forum from Hamilton Conference. And I know that people like my colleague, Don Van Eyck, were part of the planning team for that important event. Many of us know that was the spot where, on behalf of the church, moderator Bob Smith offered the words that I began with, and words that ended with, "We ask you to forgive us and to walk together with us in the Spirit of Christ, so that our peoples may be blessed and God's creation healed." Gladys Taylor, who's passed into spirit, she was a beloved elder from Curve Lake, responded at that time by saying, "I have waited my whole life to hear those words, not so much for myself as for my children and my grandchildren. Of course, I forgive you." And Gladys was speaking only for herself. She was not speaking for the entire Indigenous church. And as you probably know, at the next General Council, the Indigenous church acknowledged the apology. They expressed the hope that the church would actually live into those words. And their response concludes with these words: "The Native people of the United Church of Canada hope and pray that the apology is not symbolic, but that these are the words of action and sincerity." Well, we didn't have a lot of time in this meeting to talk fully about that. There was a bit of an opportunity to speak about healing and reconciliation work, which is active in pockets of our church. We can think of examples towards healing and reconciliation. We began our meeting with acknowledging territory, and that's just kind of what we do always now. The United Church of Canada crest that's been behind Kathy throughout this meeting has, of course, been reimagined. There are folks across the region who recently stood in solidarity over the Wet'suwet'en land sovereignty as they protest the pushing of a pipeline in the midst of the chaos of a pandemic. Some of us have added our voices to the current conflict relating to fishing rights in the Mi'kmaq lobster industry. Across our regional council, many of you have been reading widely. Richard Wagamis and Alf Dumont and Thomas King. There are book groups that have been happening. And in Thunder Bay, a Kairos blanket exercise was facilitated. All of those things are important, and I wish we'd had more time to talk about them over the course of the weekend. God's love is wider and more inclusive than we can imagine. As I think about that, it takes me to one of my favorite gospel stories. It's a story that's found in all 4 of the gospels, and a story that ends with Jesus saying, Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. It's a short passage, and I want to share it. And I'm doing so from my soot-stained ordination Bible from Yellowknife United Church. You can still smell the smoke from when our conference office burned down. While he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. But some were there who said to one another in anger, "Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For this could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and the money given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." And so it is. That incident in Simon's house was passed on by word of mouth wherever Christians went. And in that particular version, Mark's placed it just before the Last Supper as he begins to unfold the familiar events of Jesus' last hours on earth. But in spite of that, in spite of all that's swirling around him, all is not despairing. A woman enters and she goes to Jesus. It's important, I think, that she isn't remembered for who she was. We're never told her name. We don't even know what she said. In fact, she says, or it's recorded, no words at all. But what she does imprints her on the early church's memory more powerfully probably than any name or saying would have done. It's a story of a woman who intrudes herself among the men who gathered around a table, the hostility of the city all around them, just like that COVID cloud. And ignoring their disapproval, she comes with an alabaster jar of rare and precious perfume. She breaks it and she pours it entirely over Jesus' head. There were some watching who were indignant. Why the waste? And they criticized her. Let her alone, Jesus says. Why do you trouble her? She's done a beautiful thing to me. It is, I think, a good story for a weekend like we've been sharing together. And I say that because the nameless woman's action is a mirroring, if you will, of the beautiful, over-the-top love of God, a love that is wider and more inclusive than we can imagine. Jesus often talked about that almost incomprehensible kind of love. The father who runs right out of his dignity to welcome his returning son, or the one who not only bound up the traveler's wounds, but then set him on his own animal and took him to the inn and paid in advance and said whatever else is needed will be looked after. It's like such extravagant actions are the only appropriate response to our God. It was a beautiful thing she did that day because it reflected the beautiful, over-the-top love of God. Again, a love wider and more inclusive than we can imagine. I think we got glimpses of that in our discussions and reports that were approved today. While we didn't speak about it that I'm aware of in the gathering, I'm heartened by the hot off the press historic commitment of the United Church of Canada to work towards becoming an anti-racist church. that is very likely to be our shared work in the months and years ahead. There are words to be said on other days on behalf of, being cautious or being moderate. The danger, I think, for us as a regional council and for our churches is we don't need to worry about being too moderate. Our paths rarely run much risk of that kind of thing. And I think that's never been more true than right now in the midst of this pandemic, with all of the things that we in our communities of faith have to worry about. Our finances, as Peter noted today, our ministry personnel, those who are most vulnerable in our midst, even our neighbors south of the border. T.S. Eliot, in his book, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, talks about people living out their lives like the pouring out of a teaspoon. It is the exact opposite of the kind of extravagance that's described in the gospel story. The question that I want to leave you with is this: what if life was meant to be spilled, to be poured out, to be risked? What if there was no other way, as members of this regional council, no other way of fully entering the presence of God except by extravagantly flinging ourselves into these efforts to grow the connections across this vast region? The gift of the wordless woman was beautiful. She didn't send it out ahead with somebody else and stay safely back. Her life was in her gift. She holds nothing back. She does what she can, to which Jesus says it's a beautiful thing. His kind of thing. God's kind of thing. As we honor the often challenging work of supporting one another, of strengthening our communities of faith that this meeting has sought to do, and in the beautiful name of one who spilled his own life across the earth, I just invite us to bring the alabaster jars of our own lives and risk through the connections that we're making to embolden God's Spirit throughout Canadian Shield. I want to conclude, if I can, with our creed, and I'm going to invite us. I wish we could have the cacophony of unleashing our voices, but I'm pretty confident that would drive Susan Whitehead nuts, and so yeah, I can hear her yelling yes in the background. Most of you don't need the words, you know it. So let's offer our creed together. We are not alone. We live in God's world. We believe in God who has created and is creating, who has come in Jesus, the Word made flesh, to reconcile and make new, who works in us and others by the Spirit. We trust in God. We are called to be the church, to celebrate God's presence, to live with respect in creation, to love and serve others, to seek justice and resist evil, to proclaim Jesus crucified and risen, our judge and our hope. In life, in death, in life beyond death, God is with us. We are not alone. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Creator God, Great Spirit, we give you thanks for all you are and all you bring to us for our lives within your creation and here in the church. In Jesus, you place the gospel at the center of our lives. You show us the way to live generous, compassionate, and connected lives. Give us your strength to continue to grow the connection as we work together with respect and commitment, as we grow in your Spirit. For you are God, now and forever. We are not alone. Amen.